What would you do if you found out that every single dollar you paid to honor your dead husband's memory, every sacrifice, every quiet transfer, every month you told yourself you were doing the right thing, had gone straight into the pocket of the woman sitting across from you at your own kitchen table? For 14 months, I paid $500 a month to settle my late husband's debts. I thought I was protecting his name. I thought I was doing the last loving thing I could do for a man who could no longer speak for himself. Then the bank called, and the woman on the phone said 6 words that cracked my entire world in half. "Ma'am, your husband never had any debts. My name is Linda Mercer. And this is the story of how grief made me a target, how I became my own worst enemy for over a year, and how I finally decided that the truth was worth more than keeping the peace." My husband Thomas and I had been married for 19 years when his heart simply stopped on a Tuesday morning. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, tying his shoes, getting ready for work. 19 years of Sunday pancakes. 19 years of him humming off-key in the shower, of small arguments about the thermostat that never once felt like real anger. He was a high school English teacher who balanced our checkbook to the penny, clipped grocery coupons, and genuinely believed that a dollar saved today was a dollar earned tomorrow. I was 54 years old, and I had never in my life imagined what it would feel like to sit in a house that still smelled like his aftershave, knowing he wasn't coming back. The first few months after the funeral are still blurry in my memory. A fog of casseroles left on the porch. Sympathy cards I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Silence at night that pressed against my ears like something physical. It was in that fog that Sandra came to me. Sandra was Thomas's older sister. A sharp-tongued woman who had never quite warmed to me in all 19 years of our marriage. She came to my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, hands folded on the table the way they always were when she was about to deliver something unpleasant. She told me Thomas had been hiding something. Debts, she said. Gambling debts. He hadn't wanted me to know. He was ashamed. I remember staring at her, genuinely certain I had misheard. Thomas balanced our checkbook to the penny. He clipped coupons. He drove a 10-year-old car because he said a newer one wasn't worth the payments. The idea of him gambling was so far outside anything I had ever known about this man that my brain simply refused to accept it. But Sandra had papers. Printed statements with numbers that made my stomach drop. A name I didn't recognize, a collection agency, and her own quiet insistence that she didn't want to see the family name dragged through a public bankruptcy. Beside her sat Angela, Thomas's daughter from his first marriage, 28 years old and dry-eyed in a way that, looking back now, should have told me everything. "There's a way to handle this quietly," Angela said. "A private repayment plan. $500 a month. Keeps it off the record. Keeps Dad's name clean. Grief makes you stupid. I know that now. Grief makes you grateful for anyone who hands you a plan when you have none of your own. You are so lost in the dark that when someone lights even a single match, you follow it without asking where it leads." So I agreed. I set up a wire transfer on the 1st of every month to an account Sandra had prepared, made out to something called Patriot Resolution Services. I told myself it was the last gift I could give Thomas, protecting the reputation he had worked his whole life to build in our small community. The reputation of a good man who taught other people's children how to read and think and care about words. Perhaps that was the cruelest part of the whole thing. They had used the one thing I still had left, my love for him, as the key to open my wallet. 14 months passed. 14 transfers. $7,000. I quietly bled through my modest savings, the same savings Thomas and I had built together over 2 decades of careful, deliberate living. Skipped vacations. Modest cars. Packed lunches. All of it designed for a retirement we never got to share. I told myself it was almost over. Sandra said the debt was shrinking. I never saw a final number. I never saw a real contract. I never once questioned why a debt collection agency wanted personal bank transfers instead of a formal payment portal. I never asked why Sandra always insisted on cash transfers through her own personal banking app, not through any business account. I didn't ask because asking felt disloyal. Asking felt like accusing Thomas of something. And I would rather bleed quietly than dishonor a dead man I had loved for 19 years. The first crack came on an ordinary Thursday in March. I was sitting at the same kitchen table where Sandra had first laid out those papers, going through old files because I had finally decided to refinance the house. I called Thomas's old bank, First American Trust, just to confirm there were no liens on our joint accounts before I moved forward. The representative who answered was a kind-voiced woman named Diane. She put me on hold. I sat there listening to the elevator music, watching the afternoon light move across the kitchen floor in long amber stripes. When she came back, her voice had changed. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I'm looking at your husband's full credit history going back to 2003. There's no debt here. There never was. Your husband's accounts were always in excellent standing. He didn't owe First American Trust a single dollar." I sat very still. The phone was pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark. "That's not possible," I said. "There were collection notices. A repayment plan." "I don't know what to tell you," Diane said gently. "There's nothing here. Not even a late payment." I hung up and looked at the stack of statements Sandra had given me 14 months earlier. The ones I had never once thought to question because grief doesn't leave room for suspicion. My hands were shaking. 14 months. $7,000. And a collection agency that I was beginning to understand might not exist at all. If only I had asked one question sooner. But grief has a way of making silence feel like love. And some people know exactly how to use that. I sat at that kitchen table for nearly an hour without moving. The particular stillness that comes over a person when they realize they have been deceived by someone they trusted. Not the dramatic stillness of movies, but something quieter and heavier. Like a stone settling to the bottom of a lake. I thought about Sandra's folded hands. I thought about Angela's dry eyes. I thought about how easily I had believed them, because believing them had felt at the time like the most loyal thing I could do. When I finally moved, it was to get a legal pad and a pen. The same pad I had once used to plan Thomas's 60th birthday party that never happened. I wrote the number 14 at the top. 14 months. And beneath it, 500. Then I did the math I had been too numb with grief to do in real time. $7,000. Not money I had lying around carelessly. Money from the retirement account Thomas and I had built together over 2 decades of careful, deliberate life. Gone into an account called Patriot Resolution Services that, as I was starting to understand, had no connection to any real institution at all. I won't pretend I wasn't afraid. Fear came in waves that evening. Fear of what it would mean to accuse Thomas's own sister of fraud. Fear of what Angela would say to the rest of the family. Fear of being the bitter second wife who tore apart what remained of her husband's relatives over money. I had spent my whole life avoiding conflict. I was the woman who apologized when someone bumped into me at the grocery store. The idea of standing across from Sandra and calling her a liar to her face made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with dread. But underneath the fear, something else was rising. Anger. Not the hot, reckless kind. A slow, steady burn. The kind that comes from realizing that someone looked at your grief and saw not a person to comfort, but a wallet to drain. Thomas had trusted his sister. He had loved his daughter, even through the pain of his first divorce. And someone, maybe both of them, had used his memory, his good name, as a weapon to take money from his widow while she was too broken to ask questions. I made myself put the phone down. I had learned enough in 19 years of marriage to a careful man to know that confronting someone with no evidence only gives them time to build a story. If Sandra and Angela had done this deliberately, they would already have an explanation ready, smooth and reasonable, the moment I raised my voice. I needed something better than my own outrage. I needed proof. That night, I sat at the table long after the sun went down, the legal pad filling slowly with notes. I wrote every payment date I could remember. I dug through old emails for any communication from Patriot Resolution Services and found almost nothing. No official letterhead. No tax ID number. No working customer service line. Just a single email address that bounced back when I tried to reply. I found the routing number Sandra had given me for the transfers and wrote it down twice, underlining it, because even with my limited financial knowledge, a personal routing number attached to a supposed collection agency felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. By midnight, I had made a decision. I would not call Sandra. I would not call Angela. Instead, in the morning, I would call a lawyer. Not a family friend. Not someone who might soften the truth for the sake of keeping Thanksgiving peaceful, but a real attorney who specialized in financial fraud. Someone with no loyalty to anyone in this story but me. The law office of Marianne Cole sat above a dry cleaner on Patterson Boulevard. worn carpet, a view of the parking lot. But I had chosen her carefully. She specialized in widow and elder financial exploitation cases, a fact buried 3 pages deep in an online search the night before. I spread my legal pad and bank statements across her desk. She listened without interrupting for nearly 20 minutes, her pen moving steadily. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, setting her pen down, "what you're describing has a name. It's called grief-based financial exploitation. Family members who use a person's vulnerability right after a death to extract money under false pretenses. The structure here, the vague paperwork, the personal routing number, the absence of any verifiable institution, it concerns me." She agreed to take my case and within the week had filed a formal request with First American Trust for the complete transaction history tied to both my account and the Patriot Resolution Services account number Sandra had given me. Marianne told me to say nothing to Sandra or Angela in the meantime. "Let them believe everything is normal," she said. "People who are hiding something get careless when they think no one is watching." It was harder than I expected. 3 days after my appointment, Sandra called, her voice warm as butter, asking how I was holding up and whether the next payment had gone through smoothly. I forced my voice into the flat, grateful tone I had used for 14 months. "Of course. Same as always." But something in my hesitation must have registered, because she lingered a beat too long before saying goodbye. And Angela texted the next morning, oddly specific, asking whether I had spoken to the bank lately. I didn't answer. I stared at that text for a long time, feeling the cold certainty settle deeper. They were watching me as closely as I was watching them. The bank records arrived 11 days later. Marian called me into her office on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I remember the sound of the rain against the window as she slid a thick folder across the desk. The account labeled Patriot Resolution Services was not a collection agency. It was a personal checking account opened 18 months earlier, 2 months before Thomas's death, under the name Sandra A. Whitfield. Her home address 3 streets away from the house where Thomas and I had built 19 years of quiet life together. And tucked into the folder, a printout from a payment processing service showing recurring transfers from that same account directly to Angela's personal Venmo. Almost monthly. Amounts ranging from $100 to $300. I felt the room tilt slightly. Thomas had never owed anyone a cent. There had been no debt, no collection agency, no financial crisis, nothing but 2 women, his sister and his daughter, who had looked at a grieving widow and built, brick by brick, a quiet and believable lie designed to drain her for as long as she didn't ask questions. "This is documented financial fraud, Linda," Marianne said quietly, watching my face. "We can file a formal complaint, pursue civil recovery, and depending on what the district attorney decides, this could become criminal." I sat with the folder in my lap. My hands were not shaking anymore. Something had shifted inside me. Some final door closing on the version of myself who had wired $500 a month out of love and grief, and the desperate need to do right by a man who could no longer speak for himself. "Let's file," I said. I didn't know yet how hard Sandra and Angela would fight once they realized I knew. I didn't know about the threats coming, or the long cold nights of doubt still ahead. But sitting in that small office above the dry cleaner, the rain tapping steadily against the glass, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Thomas's heart gave out on that ordinary Tuesday morning. I felt like myself again. By Wednesday, my phone had not stopped ringing. The first few calls from Sandra were almost pleading. "Linda, there's been a misunderstanding. Please call me back before you do anything you'll regret." By Thursday, the tone had changed entirely. "You ungrateful woman," she spit from my voicemail. "After everything this family did for you, Thomas would be ashamed of what you're doing to his sister." I played that message twice. Then I forwarded it directly to Marianne, who told me to save every single recording. "Threats and intimidation only strengthen a fraud case," she said. "Keep documenting everything." But it was Angela's visit 3 days later that frightened me most. She came to the house unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, and when I opened the door, her face had none of the dry-eyed composure I remembered from that first kitchen table conversation. She was furious, and beneath the fury something close to panic. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said, pushing past me into the entryway without being invited. "If this goes to court, I'll tell everyone what kind of wife you really were. How you and Dad were having problems before he died. How you wanted out of the marriage. People will believe me, Linda. They always believe the grieving daughter over the second wife. It was a lie. Anyone who had truly known Thomas and me would have laughed at the suggestion. But standing in my own entryway, watching Angela's hands shake with anger, I understood what Marian had meant about people getting careless. Angela wasn't defending her innocence. She was trying to manufacture leverage. A story ugly enough to make me back down out of fear of public humiliation. I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Get out of my house, Angela. And if you contact me again outside of our attorneys, I'll add it to the file. She left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the framed photo of Thomas and me on our 10th anniversary, the one in the hallway. I stood there for a long moment after she'd gone, staring at that photo, at Thomas's easy smile, and I let myself cry. Not from fear exactly. From the exhausting weight of being threatened by people who had once sat at holiday dinners beside me. Perhaps the hardest part of fighting for the truth isn't the evidence gathering or the courtroom. It's the moment you realize the people trying to destroy you once passed you the gravy boat and smiled. Carol stopped calling and instead sent a family friend named Patricia, someone who had known Thomas since childhood, to mediate. I declined. Angela sent one final text, almost businesslike in tone, suggesting that if I dropped the complaint, she and Sandra would quietly repay what was owed. No lawyers involved. Marianne was unequivocal. Absolutely not. That's an admission disguised as an offer. Don't respond. I didn't. And then, almost as suddenly as the pressure had started, it paused. No calls. No visits. No texts. Whether they had retreated to consult their own attorney or simply run out of angles, I didn't know. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt less like a threat and more like room to breathe. I took that room. I drove 2 hours to visit my sister Karen in Columbus, someone I hadn't leaned on nearly enough since Thomas's death, and for 3 days I did almost nothing. Slept late. Walked along the river near her apartment. Let her cook for me the way she used to when we were girls and one of us had a hard week. I didn't talk about Sandra or Angela much at all. I just let myself exist quietly, away from the fight, gathering strength. I also found, almost unexpectedly, something I hadn't known I needed. A small local support group for widows navigating financial exploitation, which Marianne had mentioned almost in passing. I attended my first meeting in the basement of a community church on a Wednesday evening, nervous and unsure I belonged. But the women in that room, 6 of them ranging from their 40s to their 80s, had stories that echoed mine in ways that made my chest ache with recognition. A stepson who had forged a power of attorney. A cousin financial advisor who had drained a retirement account. Listening to them and slowly telling my own story aloud for the first time outside Marianne's office, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since that first phone call from Diane at the bank. Sandra and Angela came back one final time. Together, on a gray Sunday afternoon, dressed in soft cardigans and contrite expressions clearly meant to evoke family and warmth and reconciliation. Sandra's voice was soft. None of the venom from the voicemails. We've been thinking about Thomas a lot, Linda. He wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want us tearing each other apart. There was a time not so long ago when those words would have unraveled me completely. The invocation of Thomas's wishes. The suggestion that my pursuit of the truth was itself a betrayal of his memory. I felt the old pull of it, faint but present, a flicker of the guilt that had once made me write checks without question. But underneath that flicker was something sturdier now. Thomas would want the truth, I said quietly. He would want to know that his sister opened a personal account using his memory to take money from his widow. That's what he'd want, Sandra. Not silence. Her face shifted, the softness dropping away almost instantly. You don't understand what it's like watching my brother build a life with someone who was never really part of this family. We needed that money. Angela's been struggling since her divorce. I lost half my retirement in a bad investment. You had plenty. You always had plenty. There it was. The justification beneath the manipulation. The belief that my grief and my modest savings had simply been a resource they were entitled to. Not because of any wrongdoing on my part, but because I had been the one left standing. The one with something left to take. That doesn't make it legal, I said. And it doesn't make it forgivable. You used Thomas's death to steal from me for 14 months. I'm not interested in pretending that's a family disagreement. Angela's composure cracked entirely. You'll regret this. When this goes public, nobody in this town is going to look at you the same way. That's a threat, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I hope you understand that. I'm closing this conversation now, and everything you've just said is going straight to my attorney. I shut the door. The civil hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. Marianne walked the judge through the bank records methodically. The personal account opened by Sandra Whitfield 2 months before Thomas's death, the recurring Venmo transfers to Angela, the complete absence of any legitimate debt collection agency named Patriot Resolution Services in any state or federal registry. Then came the voicemails, played aloud in the quiet courtroom. Sandra's voice, sharp and unmistakable. You ungrateful woman, after everything this family did for you. I watched Sandra's face as her own recorded fury filled the room. Watched her attorney's jaw tighten in real time. When Sandra testified, the composure she had maintained through every phone call and porch confrontation finally began to fracture. She tried to claim the account had been a misunderstanding, a temporary holding account for debts she insisted had been real, even as Marianne calmly produced, one by one, the complete absence of any documentation supporting their existence. When pressed about the routing number, the personal nature of the transfers, the lack of any contract ever shown to me, Sandra's answers grew tangled, contradicting things she had said only minutes before. I was trying to protect my brother's memory, she said at one point, her voice cracking. Marianne said, quietly and evenly, by taking $7,000 from his widow, using an account you opened before he had even died. The silence that followed in that courtroom felt enormous. Sandra had no answer for it because there wasn't one. Angela's testimony was worse for them, if anything. Under questioning, she admitted haltingly that she had known from the beginning there were no actual debts, that the entire scheme had been Sandra's idea, after she had lost a significant portion of her retirement savings in a bad investment, that Angela had agreed to participate because she needed money after her divorce. It was the first fully honest thing either of them had said since this began. I did not raise my voice once during that hearing. I answered every question plainly, recounting the timeline as I had documented it from the very beginning. The kitchen table conversation, the 14 months of payments, the phone call from Diane at First American Trust that had cracked the whole story open. My voice stayed steady throughout, not because I had stopped feeling the weight of what had been done to me, but because I had spent nearly a year preparing for exactly this moment. The judge's findings were unambiguous. Sandra Whitfield and Angela Mercer were found to have engaged in deliberate financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Ohio law. Full restitution of the $7,000 was ordered, plus interest accrued over the nearly 2 years since the scheme had begun, plus legal fees. And more than the financial judgment, the judge explicitly recommended the case be forwarded to the county prosecutor's office for review of criminal fraud charges, given the premeditated nature of the account Sandra had opened before Thomas's death. I did not feel triumphant as the ruling was read aloud. I felt mostly exhausted, in the particular way that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. Within 3 months, the county prosecutor filed formal fraud charges against both women. Sandra, facing the larger share of culpability as the one who had opened the account and orchestrated the scheme, accepted a plea agreement that included a suspended sentence, 5 years of probation, and a permanent fraud conviction on her record. Angela's plea was lighter given her secondary role and her cooperation once the case unraveled in court, but it still left her with a conviction, a probation period, and a debt to repay that her already strained finances could barely absorb. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no tearful apology, no moment where Sandra admitted to some deeper remorse. The truth of fraud cases, I learned, is quieter and far less cinematic than people imagine. Sandra stopped attending any family gatherings that included me. Word travels fast in a small town, and a fraud conviction involving a grieving widow is the kind of story that does not stay contained, regardless of how desperately they had once tried to control the narrative. I received my restitution in full, paid out over an 18-month structured settlement supervised by the court. It would never undo the 14 months of fear and grief-fogged trust one had given away so freely. But it closed finally and completely, the chapter that had begun with that Thursday phone call from Diane. Marianne shook my hand outside the courthouse on the day the final paperwork was settled, the autumn air sharp and clean around us, and told me something I have carried with me ever since. Most people never get this kind of resolution, she said. Most exploitation cases like yours end quietly, with a family member never held accountable, because the victim is too exhausted or too afraid of the social cost to see it all the way through. You didn't let that happen. That matters more than you probably realize right now. It has been almost 3 years since that Thursday phone call from Diane changed the course of my life. I sold the house outside Dayton, not out of bitterness, but because I finally understood I wanted a fresh start somewhere that didn't carry the weight of either my grief or my fight in every single room. I moved closer to my sister Karen in Columbus, into a small bright condo with a view of a park where I walk most mornings before the city fully wakes. I used a portion of the restitution money, along with some retraining support I found through the Widow Support Group, to complete a certification in financial counseling. I now spend 3 days a week working with a local nonprofit that helps elderly and recently widowed clients protect themselves from exactly the kind of exploitation I once lived through. There is a particular quiet satisfaction in sitting across from a frightened, grieving woman, recognizing the exact shape of what she is afraid to say out loud, and helping her ask the questions I never knew to ask in time. I think of Thomas often still, especially in the early mornings on my walks through the park. I believe with the same certainty I once reserved only for grief, that he would be proud of the woman who finally, fully refused to let his memory be used as a weapon against her. Grief is not a weakness, but the people who look at someone's grief and see an opportunity, they are counting on you to believe that it is. They are counting on your love making you quiet, your loyalty making you blind, your kindness making you easy. Don't let them be right. If someone you trusted used your grief or your love against you, what would you do? Leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you truly for being here with me.